The weight of the folded linen napkin was infinitesimal, yet it landed in Arthur Finch's palm like a block of granite. For a man who had spent 68 years quantifying the world in terms of tonnage, tensile strength, and fiscal quarters, this sudden, feather-light intrusion felt more significant than the hostile takeover of a rival aerospace firm. He was a creature of habit, a titan of industry who found comfort in the predictable orbits of planets and balance sheets. His weekly solo dinner at the Gilded Cage was one such ritual, a quiet communion with the ghost of his wife, Eleanor, in the very booth where he had proposed 45 years ago. Tonight, the familiar comfort was gone, replaced by a low-frequency hum of wrongness that vibrated just beneath the surface of the restaurant's opulent calm. The gilded cherubs on the ceiling seemed to leer. Their painted smiles twisted into knowing smirks. The sommelier, a man Arthur had known for a decade, had fumbled with the corkscrew, a minuscule break in his usual, unflappable grace. Now this. A clandestine message delivered by a slip of a girl whose uniform was as starched and white as her face was pale with fear. He kept his expression impassive, a mask honed in boardrooms where fortunes were won and lost on the twitch of an eyebrow. His hand, steady as a surgeon's, closed around the napkin as he reached for his water glass. Beneath the heavy damask tablecloth, his fingers carefully unfolded the small square. The script was a frantic, feminine scrawl, the ink slightly smeared. "You're in a trap. Don't move." Arthur's heart, a reliable old engine, gave a painful lurch. He had enemies. A man worth $11 billion collected them like barnacles on a ship's hull. But an attack here, in his sanctuary. It was unthinkable. He subtly lifted his gaze, scanning the room over the rim of his glass. The girl was already 2 tables away, taking an order from the Vanderbilts, her posture a study in practiced subservience. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, emphasizing the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. Her eyes, however, were what held him. They were the color of dark honey and filled with a desperate, frantic energy that belied her calm demeanor. They weren't looking at the Vanderbilts' menu. They were fixed on a point over their shoulders towards the bar. Following her gaze, Arthur saw them. 2 men, impeccably dressed in dark, tailored suits that failed to conceal the bulk of their shoulders. They weren't the usual clientele of old money and quiet power. They were predators in a field of grazing sheep, their stillness too deliberate, their focus too intense. They had entered just after him, taking seats at the far end of the marble bar, and had ordered nothing but sparkling water. An anomaly. No one came to the Gilded Cage for the water. The waitress, he didn't know her name, a failing he now regretted, returned. As she refilled his water, her knuckles brushed his, a fleeting, cold contact. "The sea bass is excellent tonight, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice a low, controlled whisper. But her eyes flickered down to the note in his lap, then back to his face, a silent question. "Did you read it? Do you believe me?" Arthur gave a nearly imperceptible nod, his mind already shifting from nostalgic widower to corporate strategist. A trap. The word was crude, theatrical, but the girl's terror was not. He catalogued his assets, his driver and primary security detail. A former Secret Service agent named Marcus was outside in the armored sedan. The restaurant's security was notoriously discreet but thorough. The manager, Marcel, was a man Arthur had tipped extravagantly for years. An inside job, then. It was the only explanation. He needed more information. He caught the waitress's eye as she passed again. He tapped his empty wine glass. As she leaned in with the decanter of vintage Bordeaux he'd ordered, she spoke, her lips barely moving, her voice a ghost of a sound meant only for him. "The man in the grey tie, Julian Croft. He's been watching you for weeks. They have the manager. Marcel is compromised." The name hit Arthur like a physical blow, winding him more than any threat of violence. Julian Croft, his former protégé, a brilliant, ruthless young man he had mentored, nurtured, and treated like a son. A son who had tried to gut his company from the inside with a leveraged buyout funded by shadow investors 3 years ago. Arthur had crushed the attempt, banished him from the industry, and erased him from his life. He had assumed Croft was ruined, a ghost in the financial world. But ghosts, he now understood, could still bear grudges. "The wine," she breathed, her hand trembling slightly as she poured. "It's not for you. Don't drink it." He looked down at the rich crimson liquid swirling in his glass. A simple, elegant poison. How many times had he and Eleanor shared a bottle of this very vintage in this very booth? The violation was profound, a desecration of memory. This wasn't just business, it was personal, venomous. He looked at the girl again, truly looked at her this time. He saw the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the determined set of her jaw. She was risking everything, her job, her safety, for a complete stranger. "Why?" he mouthed silently. Her gaze softened for a fraction of a second, and in that fleeting moment he saw not a terrified waitress, but a weary soldier. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a gesture that said, "No time for that." She straightened up, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Enjoy your meal, sir." Arthur Finch sat back in the plush leather booth, the world having tilted on its axis. The quiet restaurant was no longer a haven, but a meticulously constructed snare. The other diners were props, the soft jazz a soundtrack to his potential demise, and his only ally was a young woman whose name he didn't even know, a woman armed with nothing but a serving tray and a terrifying amount of courage. The game was afoot, and he was the prize. But Arthur Finch had not built an empire by being a passive pawn. He would play. Clara Reed felt the tremor in her hands long after she'd left Arthur Finch's table. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the thrum of adrenaline, a familiar, sickening current she hadn't felt since the night her younger brother, Leo, had come home with a split lip and the kind of terror in his eyes that never fully fades. She'd learned then about men like Julian Croft, men who smiled while they broke you, who spoke of opportunities when they were setting snares. She had been sketching in her dog-eared notebook during her break an hour ago, practicing capturing the fleeting expressions of the diners when Croft and his 2 associates had taken their seats at the bar. An artist's eye is a curse and a gift. It forces you to see, not just look. She saw the subtle bulge under the arm of the man on the right, the kind a shoulder holster makes in even the finest Italian wool. She saw the way their eyes weren't scanning the room but mapping it, noting exits, sight lines, and the position of the security cameras. But it was her other, more secret skill that had sealed her decision. Her grandmother, deaf since her 40s, had taught Clara to read lips as a child, a game that became a language, a silent bond between them. Sitting in her break nook, which offered a clear, reflected view of the bar in a large gilt mirror, Clara had watched their conversation. Finch is a creature of habit. Croft's lips had formed, a smirk playing on them. "Marcel has the decanter ready. A few drops. He'll feel dizzy, a minor health scare. We walk him out the back to get some air." Simple. "And the girl? The new one?" the bulky man had asked. "She's irrelevant," Croft had dismissed. "Just a piece of the scenery." Irrelevant. The word had ignited a cold fire in her gut, That's what they had called Leo's friends, the ones who stood by and did nothing while he was cornered, irrelevant bystanders. She had sworn that night, holding a bag of frozen peas to her brother's swelling eye, that she would never, ever be a piece of the scenery. Now, the weight of that vow pressed down on her. Marcel, the manager, caught her eye from across the dining room. He gave a sharp, pointed look toward Mr. Finch's table, then tapped his wrist where a watch would be. "Hurry it up." The sheen of sweat on Marcel's upper lip was another detail she'd noticed, another brush stroke in the ugly portrait of this evening. He was a weak man, caught in something far beyond his control. She had to give Finch more. The drugged wine was the immediate threat. She picked up a fresh bread basket, her mind racing. The kitchen. There was a service corridor that ran behind the main dining area. She could use it to bypass Marcel. As she approached Finch's table, she saw Croft's associate, the one with the holster, get up from the bar and move towards the men's room, a path that would take him directly past their booth. He was a shark, circling. "More bread, Mr. Finch?" she asked, her voice a little too bright. She placed the basket down, using the movement to lean in close, shielding her mouth with her body. "They'll move when you feel dizzy. A car in the alley. It's a kidnapping, not a hit. They want you alive." Finch's eyes, the color of a winter sky, were sharp and analytical. There was no panic in them, only a chillingly calm assessment. He was processing, calculating. He looked past her, at the man walking towards the restroom. "Your name," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Clara." "Clara," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "What do you see that I don't?" It was a test. He wasn't just taking her word for it. He was gauging her intelligence, her observational skills. He was deciding if she was a credible asset or a hysterical girl. "The man walking past us now," she whispered, her hands busy arranging the silverware. "His suit is bespoke, but it hangs wrong on his left shoulder. He's compensating for weight. The other one at the bar has a military-style earpiece, the translucent acoustic tube kind. Not civilian tech. The manager, Marcel, hasn't looked a single customer in the eye for the last 20 minutes. And Mr. Croft? He keeps touching his tie. It's a tell. He's nervous. This is personal for him." She had laid out her evidence, the small, damning details that formed an undeniable truth. She saw a flicker of something in Finch's eyes, not just belief, but respect. He had seen it too. He had seen the pieces, but she had shown him the pattern. The man in the suit passed their table, his cologne a cloying, expensive scent. He gave them a cursory glance, his eyes lingering for a moment too long on Finch before he continued on his way. The circle was tightening. "I need to get a message to my driver," Finch said, his voice steel. "Marcus, he's outside." "The staff phones are monitored," Clara said instantly. She'd seen Marcel take a call on his cell phone earlier, his face ashen. "They'll be listening, and they'll see you use yours." Finch's jaw tightened. He was a king in his castle, but the walls had been breached. He was cut off. Clara's mind raced back to her art, to the study of composition, of using the available elements to create an effect. What elements did she have? Trays, food, water, the other staff. The bus boy, a young kid named Sam, was clearing a nearby table. He was clumsy, always nervous. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form. "There's a fire alarm pull station in the service corridor next to the kitchen," she breathed. "It triggers a direct alert to the fire department, but it also automatically unlocks all emergency exits." "It will cause a panic," Finch countered. "They're counting on you being quiet," she replied, a new, hard edge to her voice. "They're expecting a silent, seamless extraction." Panic is the one thing they can't control. He studied her, his gaze intense. He was weighing the chaos of a public alarm against the quiet certainty of the alley. He was a man who abhorred chaos, who built his life on order and control. She was asking him to embrace the one thing he despised. "When?" he asked. The associate was now emerging from the restroom. Croft was watching them from the bar. "Time was up. I'll create a diversion near the kitchen," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "When you hear the crash, don't run. Walk. Head for the main entrance, not the back. Blend in with the other patrons who will be leaving. The alarm will go off moments later. Marcus will hear it. He'll know something is wrong." It was a plan full of holes, a desperate gamble, but it was better than the alternative. "They'll come after you," Finch stated. It wasn't a question. "I'm irrelevant," she said, throwing Croft's own word back at him like a stone. "Just a piece of the scenery." She gave him one last look, a silent pact passing between the billionaire and the waitress, two unlikely allies in a gilded cage. Then she turned and walked towards the kitchen, each step taking her further into the storm. She could feel Julian Croft's eyes on her back, cold and dismissive. He had no idea the scenery was about to fight back. Arthur watched Clara walk away, her back straight, her stride deliberate. He felt a reluctant admiration, a feeling he hadn't experienced for anyone in a very long time. It was the same quality he had admired in Eleanor, a core of unyielding steel beneath a quiet exterior. He had misjudged this girl, and in his world, misjudgment was a fatal flaw. He forced his body to relax, to project the image of a man enjoying a solitary, expensive meal. He picked up his fork, pretending to study the perfectly seared sea bass on his plate. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Croft slide off his bar stool. The second man, the one with the earpiece, remained, his eyes locked on Arthur. They were beginning their approach. Croft moved with a predatory grace, weaving through the tables with a confident smile plastered on his face, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. He was playing the part of an old acquaintance, about to surprise a friend. Arthur's mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Clara's plan was audacious. It relied on precision timing and the unpredictability of human panic. He had to trust her. He had to place his life, a life insured for $50 million and protected by a small army of security professionals, into the hands of a 20-year-old art student he had met less than an hour ago. The irony was not lost on him. He saw Clara near the kitchen entrance. She was speaking to Sam, the young busboy, pointing at a stack of dirty dishes on his cart. Sam was nodding, his movements jerky and unsure. Clara placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of reassurance, but Arthur saw the tension in her fingers. She was positioning him, a pawn in her gambit. Croft was 10 feet away now. "Arthur," he said, his voice smooth as silk and laced with poison. "Fancy seeing you here. It's been too long." Arthur looked up, feigning surprise. "Julian, I'd heard you'd fallen off the face of the earth." Croft's smile tightened. "Reports of my demise were greatly exaggerated. I've just been restructuring." His eyes darted down to Arthur's full wine glass, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "Not enjoying the wine? I always remember you having a fondness for the 82 Margot." "My doctor has advised me to cut back," Arthur said dryly, his hand resting on the table, inches from a heavy silver steak knife. It was a poor weapon, but better than nothing. "A man my age has to be careful about his health." "Indeed," Croft purred, pulling up a chair and sitting down, uninvited. "Health is everything. In fact, you look a little pale, Arthur. Are you feeling all right?" This was it. The script, the feigned concern before they walked him into the dark. From across the room, Arthur saw Clara nod to the busboy. Sam pushed his rickety cart forward, directly into the main thoroughfare for the servers. It was a clumsy, amateurish move, and another waitress, laden with a tray of entrees, had to swerve sharply to avoid him. Then Clara moved. With a grace that was almost balletic, she picked up a heavy silver tray laden with water pitchers. She took 2 steps and appeared to stumble, her ankle twisting unnaturally. The crash was cataclysmic. It wasn't just the sound of shattering plates from the original script. It was the thunderous, metallic clang of the heavy silver tray hitting the marble floor, followed by the explosion of glass as 2 full pitchers shattered. Water and ice sprayed across the slick floor in a wide, treacherous arc. The entire restaurant flinched. Diners gasped. Staff froze. In that split second of universal shock, Arthur moved. He didn't run. He stood up, placing his napkin on the table as if merely inconvenienced by the commotion. "Quite a mess," he said to Croft, his voice even. Croft was momentarily distracted, his head snapping towards the sound. His carefully laid plan was unraveling. This wasn't the quiet, controlled scenario he had envisioned. "Stay seated, Arthur," he hissed, his mask of civility slipping to reveal the raw snarl beneath. But Arthur was already walking, moving with the crowd of curious onlookers who were now standing to get a better view of the chaos. He kept his pace steady, his shoulders back, just another wealthy patron annoyed by a disturbance. He could feel the eyes of the second man on him, but in the confusion, a direct move would expose them. He saw Clara on the floor, amidst the wreckage. Marcel was rushing towards her, his face a mask of fury and panic. "You clumsy little fool!" he shrieked. Clara looked up, her eyes finding Arthur's for a brief, electric moment. There was no fear in them now, only a silent, urgent command. "Go!" Then a new sound cut through the din. A high-pitched, insistent shriek. The fire alarm. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the opulent room in a stark, pulsating glow. Panic, real and immediate, erupted. The carefully cultivated atmosphere of the gilded cage shattered. People were pushing back chairs, grabbing purses and coats, their voices rising in a confused babble. This was the chaos Clara had promised, the perfect cover. Arthur allowed himself to be swept along with the tide of exiting patrons, a grey-haired man in a sea of panicked faces. He reached the grand oak doors of the main entrance, just as he heard a furious shout from behind him. "Stop him! Don't let him leave!" Croft had abandoned all pretense. But it was too late. Arthur pushed through the doors into the cool night air of Manhattan. He saw his car, the black sedan idling by the curb, and standing beside it, his hand already on his holstered weapon, was Marcus, his face grim, his eyes scanning the building. The alarm had done its work. Relief washed over Arthur, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He had made it. He was safe. But then, through the glass of the doors, he saw it. Croft's bulky associate had reached Clara, who was still on the floor. He grabbed her by the arm, hauling her to her feet with brutal force. Marcel was pointing a shaking finger at her, his face contorted with rage, shouting something Arthur couldn't hear. Croft was striding towards them, his expression murderous. They knew she had done it. Every instinct, every lesson learned over a lifetime of self-preservation screamed at Arthur to get in the car and drive away. Let Marcus and his team handle it. The girl had served her purpose, but he saw her face, pale and defiant, as the man twisted her arm behind her back. He heard her small cry of pain, a sound that was swallowed by the alarm, but that he felt in his bones. He thought of her whispered warnings, the desperate courage in her eyes, the simple, impossible choice she had made to help him. Irrelevant, just a piece of the scenery. Arthur Finch stopped, He turned back towards the chaos he had just escaped. "Marcus," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Code Black, full entry. The girl inside, Clara. She is the priority asset. Bring her out, whatever it takes." Marcus didn't hesitate. He spoke urgently into his wrist communicator, and from the shadows, 3 other men in dark suits materialized, moving with the fluid, deadly efficiency of apex predators. Arthur, however, didn't wait for them. He ignored Marcus's frantic, "Sir, no," and did the single most illogical, reckless, and profoundly human thing he had done in 40 years. He turned and walked back into the trap. The inside of the gilded cage had devolved from panic into a tense, armed standoff. The remaining patrons and most of the staff had been herded towards the far wall by Croft's second man, a short, stocky individual with dead eyes, and a pistol held with unnerving stillness. The shrieking of the fire alarm was a maddening, incessant backdrop to the drama unfolding in the center of the room. Julian Croft stood before Clara, his handsome face ugly with rage. The bulky associate, whose name she now knew was Dimitri, held her arm twisted behind her back at a painful angle. The adrenaline that had sharpened her senses was beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep, throbbing ache and the cold tendrils of fear. "You!" Croft spat, his voice a low snarl that was barely audible over the alarm. "The little waitress, you did this, all of this." "It was an accident," Clara gasped, trying to keep her voice from shaking. The floor was slippery. "Don't play games with me," Croft sneered, stepping closer. He reached out and grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were chips of ice. "I had him. I had Arthur Finch. Years of planning, ruined by a clumsy minimum-wage nobody. Who are you? Who do you work for?" "I work for the restaurant," she said, defiance flaring through the pain. Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Marcel!" he snapped, not taking his eyes off Clara. "Tell me about her. What's her story?" The manager scurried forward, wringing his hands, his face slick with sweat. "Her name is Clara Reed, Mr. Croft. She's only been here 2 months. A nobody, sir, I swear. She's an art student. Quiet. I don't know how she could have... An art student," Croft mused, his grip tightening on her chin. "An eye for detail, perhaps? You saw something, didn't you? You saw us." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "What was our mistake, little artist? I'm always looking to improve my methods." Before Clara could answer, a voice, calm and resonant with authority, cut through the noise. "Let her go, Julian." Every head turned. Arthur Finch stood just inside the main doorway, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. He looked not like a man who had just escaped a trap, but like a chairman entering a boardroom he owned. Croft's eyes widened in disbelief, which quickly morphed into a triumphant, predatory grin. "Arthur, my dear Arthur, to what do we owe this unexpected pleasure? Did you forget your doggy bag?" "I came back for my property," Arthur said, his gaze fixed on Clara. Croft's grin widened. "Your property? Don't tell me you've developed a sentimental attachment to the help in your old age." He gestured with his head to Dimitri, who tightened his grip. Clara cried out as a sharp, lancing pain shot up her shoulder. Arthur's face remained a stony mask, but Clara saw a muscle jump in his jaw. "She has nothing to do with this. This is between you and me. Let her walk out that door, and you can have me. No tricks, no more alarms." It was the ultimate bargaining chip, an $11 billion life offered in exchange for hers. For a moment, the entire room was silent, save for the relentless alarm. Clara stared at him, bewildered. Why? Why would he do this? He was safe. He had won. "You see," Croft said, turning his attention back to Clara, a sick look of discovery on his face. "You're not irrelevant at all. You're leverage." He looked back at Arthur. "A noble offer, Arthur. Truly touching. But I think I've learned my lesson about trusting you. I prefer to have insurance." He nodded to Dimitri. "Take her to the back. We'll use the service exit, as originally planned. Arthur will be joining us." Dimitri began to drag Clara towards the kitchen. She struggled, kicking and twisting, but the man's grip was like iron. She looked back at Arthur, her eyes wide with desperation. He hadn't moved. He just stood there, watching her be dragged away. A flicker of doubt, cold and bitter, entered her heart. Had it all been a bluff? But then she saw it. A subtle, almost imperceptible hand signal from Arthur. A closed fist, followed by 2 extended fingers. It was a signal she'd seen Marcus, the driver, use once when directing traffic for Mr. Finch's car. A military sign. It meant 2 minutes. 2 minutes to what? As Dimitri pulled her through the swinging doors into the stainless steel chaos of the kitchen, the world exploded. The main windows of the dining room imploded inward in a shower of glittering glass. 4 men in black tactical gear poured into the room, moving with a silent, synchronized lethality that was terrifying to behold. Marcus was at their lead. "Federal agents," he bellowed, though it was a lie. "Everybody down." Croft spun around, his face a canvas of pure shock. The other gunman near the hostages instinctively raised his weapon. It was the last mistake he ever made. A silenced shot, a small pututash, and he crumpled to the ground. In the kitchen, Dimitri reacted instantly. He shoved Clara against a prep table and drew his own weapon, using her as a shield. "Stay back!" he roared, pointing his gun toward the swinging doors. "I'll kill her!" Clara's mind went white with terror. The cold metal of the table pressed against her back, the smell of bleach and old grease filling her nostrils. This was it. This was how it ended. But then, another sound. Not from the dining room, but from above. A loud hissing. She looked up. On the ceiling was the kitchen's fire suppression system, a network of pipes and nozzles designed to douse grease fires with a massive cloud of chemical foam. And standing on a prep counter at the far end of the kitchen, having scrambled up with the agility of a man half his age, was a sous chef who had hidden when the commotion started. He was holding the manual release lever. He caught Clara's eye and nodded. He had clearly been briefed by one of Finch's men who had entered from the rear. The hissing intensified into a roar. A thick, white, suffocating wave of foam erupted from the nozzles, instantly filling the top half of the kitchen. Dimitri cursed, blinded, and instinctively ducked, pulling Clara down with him. In that moment of disorientation, Clara acted. She wasn't a damsel. She wasn't leverage. She was a fighter. She stomped down, hard, with the heel of her sensible work shoe onto Dimitri's instep. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She wrenched herself free, dropping to the floor and scrambling away on her hands and knees under the expanding cloud of foam, crawling blindly towards where she thought the service corridor was. Behind her, she heard shouting, another silenced shot, and then a heavy thud. She kept crawling until her hand hit a wall. She followed it, her lungs burning from the chemical taste of the foam. She found a door, pushed it open, and tumbled out into the relative quiet of the service corridor. She lay there, gasping, covered in white foam, her heart feeling like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. A moment later, strong hands were lifting her to her feet. It was Marcus. His face was grim, but his eyes were kind. "You're safe now, miss," he said. He led her back into the dining room. The alarm had finally been silenced. The scene was one of controlled chaos. Croft was on his knees, his hands cuffed behind his back, a look of utter defeat on his face. Marcel, the manager, was sobbing in a corner, being spoken to by a police officer. Arthur Finch stood in the center of it all, speaking quietly with Marcus. He looked up as she approached, and his composure finally broke. His face flooded with a relief so profound it seemed to take years off his age. He strode forward, shrugging off the protests of his security team, and stopped directly in front of her. He didn't say anything. He simply reached out and gently brushed a fleck of fire-suppressant foam from her cheek. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "You came back," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. It was the only thing she could think to say. "You taught me something tonight, Clara," Arthur Finch replied, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You taught me that some things are not irrelevant. Not ever." He stood there with her, a silent, unmovable shield, as the flashing red and blue lights of the arriving police cars painted the broken windows of the gilded cage. The aftermath was not a swift, clean resolution. It was a slow, grinding process, thick with the bureaucracy of law and the lingering residue of trauma. The 2 days following the incident at the gilded cage were a blur of police statements, witness interviews, and the disorienting glare of fluorescent lights in precinct waiting rooms. Clara retold her story so many times the words began to lose their meaning, becoming a flat, rehearsed narrative. She was no longer a waitress or an art student. She was the key witness. She lost her job, of course. The restaurant was... The silence that followed, the sirens, was a different kind of predator. It crept into Clara's small apartment on the 4th floor walk-up, seeping into the thin walls and pooling in the corners where the shadows were deepest. In the days after the gilded cage, she learned that the absence of noise could be as deafening as the alarm that had saved her life. She would be sketching, the familiar scrape of charcoal on paper, a comforting rhythm, only to be jolted by the screech of tires on the street below, her heart hammering a frantic, panicked tattoo against her ribs. The world, once a place of line and color, had been overlaid with a new, invisible geometry of threats and escape routes. Her job was gone, vaporized in the explosion of shattered glass and police tape. The gilded cage became a local news spectacle, its name a grim pun she couldn't escape. Her manager, Marcel, in a desperate, craven attempt to save himself, had initially painted her as an accomplice to Croft, a wild accusation that was quickly disproven, but left a sticky, toxic residue. Her phone buzzed with calls from reporters, their feigned sympathy a thin veil for their hunger. She stopped answering, retreating into the fortress of her apartment, her world shrinking to the view of the brick wall across the alley. On the 3rd day, a sharp knock on her door sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her. She froze, charcoal stick clutched in her hand like a weapon. The knock came again, firm but not aggressive. "Ms. Reed, my name is Evelyn Albright. I'm an attorney. I've been sent by Mr. Finch." The woman who stood in the hallway was the antithesis of the chaos Clara had endured. She was a study in controlled elegance, her grey suit impeccably tailored, her gaze direct and discerning. She didn't offer platitudes or condolences. She offered solutions. In the space of 20 minutes, sitting on Clara's lumpy sofa, Ms. Albright laid out a plan with the precision of a military strategist. A restraining order was being filed against Julian Croft. All media inquiries would be routed through her office. A substantial sum of money, described as a discretionary fund for relocation and recovery, had been wired to Clara's account. It was enough to live on for more than a year. Finally, she handed Clara a card for a therapist, a Dr. Anya Sharma, who specialized in acute trauma. Her services have been retained for you, for as long as you require them, Miss Albright stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Clara sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the sheer, formidable efficiency of it all. It was a rescue operation, executed with the impersonal force of a corporate takeover. She was grateful, profoundly so, but a strange hollowness bloomed in her chest. She had been a person that night, an actor in the drama. Now, she was a line item on a balance sheet, a potential liability being expertly managed. The file labeled Clara Reed was being closed. Miles away, in a penthouse that floated above the city like a glass-walled citadel, Arthur Finch was waging a war on ghosts. The attempted kidnapping had not just threatened his life. It had fractured the very foundations of his world. The betrayal of Julian Croft, a boy he had mentored, a mind he had sharpened, a son he had never had, was a poison that had seeped into everything. He saw phantoms of that betrayal everywhere. He spent his days in a state of controlled paranoia, surrounded by a new, expanded security team. He was a king reviewing the ramparts of his castle, searching for cracks. He dissected every department, every investment, every personal relationship, hunting for the rot he had allowed to grow. He fired men he had known for 20 years, not for overt disloyalty, but for the subtler sin of complacency. The old lion had been woken, and he was cleaning his den with a terrifying cold fury. But at night, when the city became a silent carpet of distant lights, the fury would recede, leaving behind a vast, echoing loneliness. He would pour himself a brandy, not the 82 Margot, he couldn't bear to even look at it now, and walk to the west-facing window of his private study. On the wall was a large, empty space, a rectangle of pale silk where his wife Eleanor's favourite painting had once hung. A Mary Cassatt, a tender portrait of a mother and child. It had been stolen 2 decades ago, and though he owned hundreds of other masterpieces, he had never filled that space. It was a monument to a perfect, irreplaceable loss. He found himself thinking of the girl, Clara. His team provided him with daily, discreet reports on her. He read the transcripts of her police interviews, marveling at the clarity of her memory, the precision of her observations. She hadn't just seen danger, she had analyzed it, deconstructed it, and found its weaknesses. He watched the restaurant's security footage over and over again, not the chaotic climax, but the quiet moments before. He watched her approach his table, the subtle shift in her posture, the controlled fear in her eyes. He watched her create the diversion, a calculated act of chaos that was as strategically brilliant as any boardroom maneuver he had ever witnessed. She was not a victim who had gotten lucky. She was a warrior who had chosen her weapon, a serving tray, a water pitcher, a word whispered at the right moment. He felt an overwhelming, complicated urge to speak to her, to hear her voice without the filter of lawyers and reports. But he hesitated. What could he say? "Thank you for saving my life." The words felt laughably inadequate, a pebble tossed into a canyon. His world was one of power and money, of leverage and control. To thank her with those tools felt like a profanity. He had sent money, lawyers, doctors, the crude instruments of his power, because he was afraid that anything more personal would contaminate her. He was a walking embodiment of the world that had almost killed her. To bring her closer felt like pulling her back into the cage. 3 months passed. Autumn bled into the trees of Central Park, painting them in hues of rust and gold. Clara had found a fragile rhythm. The therapy helped, giving her tools to quiet the frantic thrum of anxiety that lived just beneath her skin. She bought new canvases, the largest she could afford, and filled her apartment with the sharp, clean scent of turpentine. But her art had changed. Before, she sketched life, the hurried commuter, the laughing child, the old woman on a park bench. Now, her charcoal found itself drawn to details of tension, the tight grip of a hand on a coffee cup, the hunted look in a stranger's eyes, the anatomy of a shadow. Her work was more powerful, more honest, but it frightened her. One Tuesday afternoon, her phone rang. An unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail, but some impulse made her answer. "Hello? Miss Reed? Clara, this is Arthur Finch." The voice was exactly as she remembered it, a low, resonant baritone, but now it was threaded with an uncharacteristic hesitation. She stood up from her easel, her heart giving a sudden, sharp kick. "Mr. Finch," she said, her own voice a little breathless. There was a pause. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, not at all." "Good," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Miss Albright informs me that you are settling, that the arrangements have been satisfactory." "Yes, thank you. More than satisfactory." "I don't know how to thank you," she stammered, feeling the inadequacy of the words herself. "It is I who should be thanking you," he said, and the formality in his tone was like a wall between them. "Which, in fact, is the reason for my call. I have a proposition. It is unusual. You are, of course, entirely free to decline." He explained about the stolen cassette, Eleanor's painting. He told her about the recovered piece in Geneva, the whispers of forgery, the conflict among his experts. "They can analyze the chemical composition of the paint, the age of the canvas, the microscopic fractures in the gesso," he said, his voice losing some of its stiffness, becoming more animated. "They can give me data, an ocean of it. But data has no soul, Miss Reed. Eleanor said the painting wasn't just an image. She said it was a captured breath, a moment of quiet truth." He took a breath himself. "My judgment is compromised. I want it to be real too badly. My experts are compromised by their own egos. I need an honest eye, an artist's eye. I need someone who understands the difference between a perfect copy and a truthful line. I was hoping that someone could be you." Clara sank onto her stool, the phone pressed hard against her ear. This wasn't charity. This wasn't a reward. This was a commission. He wasn't asking her to be a grateful victim. He was asking her to be an expert. He was acknowledging the very skill, that sharp, observant eye, that had saved them both. He was offering her a way to reclaim the part of herself that the trauma had tainted. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong, without a trace of a tremor. "I'll do it." The viewing room in the Geneva Freeport was a place devoid of all character, a sterile white cube designed to be invisible, to force all focus onto the object within it. And there it was, resting on a velvet-lined easel. Mother's Kiss. Clara spent 2 days alone with the painting. The first day she didn't touch it. She simply sat and looked. She let the painting speak to her, studied the play of light across the child's cheek, the tender curve of the mother's hand. She sketched it, not to copy it, but to understand its compositional grammar, the rhythm of its forms. On the second day, wearing white cotton gloves, she examined it up close with a magnifier, cross-referencing her observations with the thick binders of technical analysis the experts had provided. The data was perfect. The pigments were period correct. The canvas weave matched known cassette works from that year. The craquelure, the fine network of cracks in the paint, was consistent with natural aging. It was, by every scientific measure, authentic. But it felt wrong. It was in the brush strokes. They were confident, precise, masterful. too masterful. She thought of her own work, the way a line would sometimes hesitate, searching for the right contour, the way a color would be layered and scraped back, a visible history of the artist's decisions. True creation was a process of discovery. This was a performance. The artist knew exactly where every stroke was going before it was laid down. There was no breath, no hesitation, no moment of quiet truth. It was a brilliant echo, but the original sound was gone. She flew back and met Arthur in his penthouse. The city glittered below them, a universe of cold fire. She didn't hand him her written report. She looked him in the eye and told him her conclusion directly. The forger wasn't just an artist, she explained, her voice filled with a strange respect for the anonymous creator. They were a scholar. They copied the science of the painting, the history of it. But they couldn't copy the heart. Eleanor was right. The real painting was a captured breath. This one is holding its breath. Arthur listened, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he was silent for a long time. He walked to the window and looked down at the city. "A beautiful lie," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I've spent a lifetime insulating myself with them. Thank you, Clara, for giving me the truth. It's a much rarer commodity." He turned back from the window, and the formidable titan of industry was gone. In his place was an old, tired man, surrounded by priceless objects, but possessing very little of value. That day marked a subtle but profound shift. He didn't offer her a job, he offered her a problem. "I'm establishing a new endowment in my wife's name," he said. "The Eleanor Finch Endowment for the Arts. I want to fund students like you, the ones with talent but without access. And I want to create a small, agile team, an art recovery unit that uses a combination of real expertise and unconventional thinking to track down stolen pieces. I know how to structure a foundation. I know nothing about how to find its soul. I need a partner, a consultant." It was a beginning. Over the next 2 years, they built it together. It was a slow, meticulous process. They traveled to museums, interviewed art historians, and sifted through hundreds of scholarship applications. An unlikely friendship took root, nurtured in the quiet reverence of galleries and the shared work of creating something meaningful. He taught her the language of finance and strategy. She taught him to see the subtle narratives hidden in a brushstroke or a line of poetry. The power dynamic between them slowly dissolved, replaced by a deep, mutual respect. He took an interest in her brother, Leo. It wasn't a handout. Arthur saw in the boy a restless, unfocused energy, and offered him a demanding apprenticeship in the global logistics division of his company. Leo, given structure and responsibility for the first time in his life, thrived. Watching him grow, Clara realized that Arthur wasn't just helping her family. He was healing a part of himself, learning to be a mentor again, but this time with wisdom instead of just ambition. One crisp October afternoon, almost 2 years to the day of the incident, they stood together in his private vault. The empty space on the wall was still there, a silent testament to all that had happened. "I've decided it's time to fill this space," Arthur said quietly, "but not with a ghost, with something new." "I have something you should see," Clara said, a small smile on her face. She led him to a canvas leaning against the far wall, draped in a white cloth. She pulled it away. The painting was hers. It was not a grand historical scene or an abstract explosion of color. It was quiet, intimate. The perspective was from behind a man's shoulder, looking down at a small table in a restaurant. The gilded, opulent background was blurred, impressionistic, a cage of out-of-focus light. The sharp focus was on the center, the man's large, strong hand resting on the table, and a young woman's hand, slender and pale, placing a small, folded white napkin next to it. The light from an unseen window fell across their hands, illuminating the space between them, a space charged with fear, courage, and a nascent, impossible connection. The brush strokes were soft, hesitant in places, yet filled with a fierce, gentle energy. Arthur stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. He slowly raised his own hand, as if to touch the painted version of it, then let it fall to his side. He didn't need to. He could feel the memory of the moment on his skin. He saw it all: the terror, the choice, the trust, and the beginning of everything that came after. "A stolen moment," he whispered, the words thick with the memory of his wife. Clara stepped closer, standing beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. "A shared one," she corrected softly. He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she no longer saw a billionaire, a victim, or a boss. She saw her friend. The vast, empty space on the wall no longer seemed like a void of loss. It was a space of possibility, waiting. The gilded cage was gone. In its place, they had built a foundation, a future. They had taken the ugliest of truths and, together, had managed to turn it into a thing of beauty.